receiving the same education that they did. Though it is funny looking at this now as it's been a few years and seeing some of these covers and perhaps arguably questionable content.
Hi, I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 28 years.
I'm Ellie Blue, the Vice President of Microcosm. We started this podcast to share what we've learned with newer publishers, so you can learn from our mistakes. Or maybe you just want to learn about the publishing industry.
Why do covers matter? Chiefly because the market is incredibly crowded. I have been doing research for the new edition of People's Guide to Publishing. As of today, there are over 130 million books in print. That is a ginormous jump from even 7 years ago when I last researched this. And with 130 million books in print, you have a very brief window to hold someone's attention. So you have to really think through a lot of different things. And so chiefly, you're communicating the vital information. Most people think about this as like facts and details, not just, and aesthetics, emotions, things like that. But because there are so many books, what happens a lot is people that work in publishing get a little overwhelmed. They get a little bit thinking that, we have a lot to communicate very quickly, but we also simultaneously need to communicate every single thing. And so the result of that is that you believe that it can sort of be like a camel where it includes every last idea. But that doesn't really work either, because you really want to hold to a few simple, singular iconographic images that hold the cover together better, Chiefly information and accessibility. Those are the sort of the two things that you want to hold on to the most when thinking about a cover design. But then you're also holding on to other things like how does it feel? What is the age range that's being communicated by it? How sophisticated does the sophistication of the cover match the sophistication of the book? Does it effectively tell people what the subject is, what the genre is, what the feel of the book is? And a lot of this is really important because readers claim that design doesn't influence their choices, but that's because design is subliminal. It's like you're communicating a lot with a little. And so the real way that you see the reader preference over design is when people say things like, I don't like it, or conversely, I'm going to buy this one. And they can't really quite tell you why. A lot of that is the packaging and the cover doing its job. And then this is like quadruply so in fiction, where you have a lot of like really contemporary design tropes, all of which we will look at a little bit later. And so you'll see these things where you'll have like profile silhouettes, or you'll see like tree branches surrounding evocative typefaces, or there was a period in time that I uncovered of white women sleeping in various poses to communicate different things. That one was particularly fascinating, I thought. And so everything, like there's some books that only show the character's feet. There's like all kinds of weird things that people do with book covers. And so you want to really pull back and be like, okay, what's the important thing we need to communicate? What should people notice first, second, third, things like that. And then you'll also see like genre things like, romance novels with vampires have like not only like very specific gothic typefaces, but they also have like red and black color palettes, So the cover is telling you who it's for, why they care, what is unique or different about the book, details and vital information about the book. So, and the way that you do this is that you start with what are called comparable titles, which are 3 titles that are similar. And then you look at how they handled these hurdles, and then you sort of amalgamate them to like tell your own story. And you have 4 to 5 seconds to hold somebody's attention for them to decide if it's right, first of all, to put in their store, and then second of all, for them to take home with them. So next up, you have the rule of thirds. And in our sample on the here, it's like where your eye goes, essentially. So like in Mark Twain Was Right, like your eye lands on Mark Twain Was Right, and it's actually a little bit hard to land on anything else, which is awkward. And on 6 Days in Cincinnati, your eye kind of lands lower on the page, like you're looking at the image because the image is more eye-grabbing than the typeface, But you're really wanting to pay attention to like what are the first, second, and third things that attract your eye. And then the best advice I've ever received is truly the simplest, which the 6 Days in Cincinnati conforms to, but Mark Twain Was Right does not, is make the title the width of the entire cover, because the tendency is to I was told that my design was not confident enough for many years, and so I sort of pulled back to look at that more. And then the second best advice I ever received was to evaluate the contrast on the cover from converting it to grayscale, and then seeing how distinguishable the elements still look. And then, alternately like looking at it in thumbnail when it's small and seeing what you notice. And so similarly, you can see that Mark Twain Was Right does not work in contrast because the black and the brown are actually so close to each other that you probably don't even notice that that's a 2-color printing job. And so it's not really doing a lot of heavy lifting. And so for anybody that's not familiar, this is the same book. We republished this book from 2012 in 2017. We struggled to sell the first 300. And then when we republished it, we sold out immediately and have had to reprint. So it's literally the same book in a different cover. Contents are identical. In the original ones, we literally just had new covers bound on top of the existing ones. And some of the library vendors were not thrilled about that. But, it did what it needed to do. It found the audience for the book. And it was a great case study because it's literally the exact same book. And so, when you think that a book cover is solid and, looks like your comps, you want to squint a little bit and then see where your focus goes. Where does your brain zero in on the cover? What is the first, second, and third thing you notice then when you're like a little bit out of focus? And then you want to ask, is this the order of significance of these items on the cover? And then if not, you want to revise the cover until it is. And then you want to think like, does this accurately communicate the reading age? So in this example, this is also real. This was the author's proposed cover for Make Your Place on the left, which she submitted. And this is literally a hand-painted piece of paper that she mailed to us because she was not a computer user. And the one on the right is the one that we designed, which is still on the book today. And, it's a beautiful, fascinating cover on the left. The house as meteor storming through the galaxy or the night sky. Hard to say, really. But it doesn't really communicate what the book's value proposition is. It doesn't tell you what the book is about. It looks like maybe it's a fun children's book or in some way playful. It's ambiguous, And so, you want to look at like, would the right people have found this book from this original cover? Probably not. And then similarly, on the left is the cover of Making Stuff and Doing Things from, I think that's the 2002 cover. And then on the right is the 2017 cover. And we just updated that mostly because as design, I don't know, trends, you could kind of say, like contemporary interests change. And so you want to not have something that looks too outdated. And we were really trying to better show like what the book offers, what it's about, that it's like a whole bunch of projects and not just about like people hanging out camping. And then these were the original covers submitted by the author, who is, it is important. Well, I guess it is now, I believe, a New Yorker cartoonist, but was a gallery artist in the 90s, you know, so, and these were, you know, these would be great gallery programs, but they don't exactly perfectly tell you a whole lot about this book. You know, it makes it look like it's like a crafting book on the right, and then on the left it kind of feels like that would be some sort of personal work of the author, which it is sort of, it's sort of the right, but it's not quite there. You know, that like also makes it look like it's for like a more sophisticated audience when it's kind of more for a general audience. So we retinkered that, as is our job. And then sometimes, you know, these are what I would call like a functional yet ugly cover. Like both of these books tell you very clearly what it is and who it's for in very plain language on the cover that nobody would mistake. How to Say It for First-Time Managers, Winning Words and Strategies for Earning Your Team's Confidence. You have to kind of wonder where that color palette came from and like what we're supposed to take from that. But other than that, you know, it's working. It's doing something. And then alternately, you have Healing Back Pain Naturally, which, you know, I guess the image of the back seems unnecessary, but you know, it's like it again, telling you, showing you, they've got a quote from a doctor on there. It's, you know, it just sounds really commanding, you know. And then we have Befriend Your Brain and Unfuck Your Brain. So it's kind of the same idea. Like we skewed it a bit younger for Befriend Your Brain to really show like this is for a younger audience, in addition to it being for an audience that maybe is swearing averse. And, you know, that's like pretty standard kind of stuff, not too technical or advanced. And then on the right, it kind of shows that it's a playful book, but it's a serious book at the same time. The trouble with this one is that we really had to convince people that it was not a humor book, because that was sort of where everybody's brains went. But we seemingly landed that pretty well because, you know, the book has been super successful. So that's more or less how you tell if a cover is functional. Like you would think that you would know if a cover is functional if it's beautiful art or it's like conveying multiplicity of all the important details of the book. But in reality, no. A cover works because the right people find it and like it and buy it, you know. And some more examples, the new edition of How to Resist Amazon and Why. You know, we wanted to show sort of the idealized version of like the world this book was projecting rather than, you know, the like simple typeface. And we got some pushback on that. But again, book found its audience, book went through multiple reprints, books, you know, it's, you know, this was a hard one to screw up, but, you know, we managed to not screw it up. And then Bang, similarly, that's like actually sort of a more complicated cover to design around because, you know, it's like you're trying to convey something that you can't really show. And the most important word to put on the cover is very long. Like you don't, like any time you have a 4-syllable word, that is your keyword. That's difficult because it's hard to make it bold and visible without having it stricken across lines. Like we struggled with that with basic fermentation because we really, and I can't remember if we split that across lines or not in the end. We'll probably come back to that later in this. And then we have some more nebulous characters here. So caps lock, how capitalism took hold of graphic design and how to escape from it. See, again, I feel like, well, you could kind of take it either way. I don't think this is a well-designed cover, but I think that's what makes it effective. And so it's like you're showing a lot of things and you're breaking a lot of rules and you're putting the barcode on the front cover where it does not belong. And you're kind of, I don't know. I struggle if that's a statement on capitalism or like an amateur maneuver, or they hired a designer that had never done a book cover before. We may never know. However, is your child psychic? I feel like this one belongs with like the afterlives of pets and other things, because you know that anybody, well, spoiler alert, I have not read this book, but I'm willing to bet that it does insist that your child is psychic, no matter what. And I believe that, it's like, it's the kind of book that's sort of like preying on the reader's desired outcome. It's kind of like why doesn't she just leave, or things that have like, nobody is reading certain kinds of books unless the answer is yes. And then similarly, a lot of times you want to show the value proposition, so like with cabin tripping, you want to be like, yes, this is what it feels like to go cabin tripping. Sold, and then it doesn't really matter quite so much. Like you might care that J.J. Eggers is the founder of the Cabin Chronicles, but most people are going to buy that book because they're like, cabin tripping. Yes, I like this idea. This sounds very good for my time. And Dispatches from Inaris, similarly, it's showing in a science fiction setting, what it would feel like, what the stories will offer, what it will feel like to read this book. And then A Naughty Knitted Noel is somehow a real book. And this goes on my shelf of books that should not exist, but I have a copy of, because nobody would believe me that it existed if I didn't have one there. And it's questionable, like, who is the audience for this book? Like, is there an audience for this book? Is the audience for this book people buying it as gag gifts? It's hard to say, really, but again, it's doing a good job of showing what it is and maybe who it's for. And then similarly, what we did with The Life and Times of Butch Dykes is, like, we wanted to show that it's like famous people. We wanted to show that they're successful people. We wanted to be like, it's another one where like it has a very self-contained audience, and you wanted to show like relative age range, things like that. And a lot of times, believe it or not, the most niche books, like the books that feel like they're a little bit ridiculous and out there, are often the ones the cover matters the most, because Granny Potty Mouth's Fast as Fuck cookbook, if they didn't accentuate those details, and her badass sunglasses, like if this just looked like any other cookbook and you didn't know that the recipes were seasoned with sass, you would probably pass by it. It would have no reason to exist, and it may still have no reason to exist, but because essentially like what you're left with is recipes. And then similarly, Rude Food, is a book that, like, without the photography and without the development, like, would it have a reason to exist? You know, I'll leave that one for you to decide. And, you know, sometimes like the way that fiction and memoir is developed is a little more limiting because, you know, there's not necessarily singular elements to show. You know, you're looking at this more along the lines of like, okay, famous author or not famous author, vibe, feeling, things like that. And then usually fiction is sold by blurb from more famous person than author. And then similarly, memoir, kind of the same idea. Like either the person is famous or the person is endorsed by a famous person. And more than that, it has to like feel good in your hands, but a lot of it comes down to like essentially a super contemporary, short-lived design concept that may not survive.
Joe, can I ask a question?
You may.
Are you talking about like what you can tell from the size of the author name?
Oh, that's a good one too. Yeah, I guess that's great. You know, you'd think that Alaska Thunderfuck 5000 would be an unknown, unimportant person, but like I feel like that name should be larger. Like it should be comparable to the other one, you know, like they both are going to be by their audience known by, you know, because of who they are in their work rather than, you know, just the same way as like a Stephen King or something would be known. Just like the segmentation is a little bit different, you know, but the idea, the design concept is the same. And then these I feel like are interesting because it's like I'm still not entirely sure what skin is trying to communicate other than, you know, the person has some like maybe cracked porcelain skin, but message is slightly unclear. You know, we may never get a full answer on that. And then Zero Fade, it's a younger book, and so it's trying to convey that. And, you know, they're trying to use the review from Kirkus to show credential for the author, you know, for people that would have been on the fence otherwise. And you maybe can't tell here, but this is a very small trim paperback. So it's, you know, they're trying to make it feel small in your hands so it, you know, has the experience of reading quickly. And then similarly, we have cases like this that are a little bit weird. Judy Blume is a famous children's author, but Wifey is not a children's book. Wifey was her foray into erotica. So, you know, it's kind of interesting. Most authors would revamp and use a pen name for something like that, especially in this era where, you know, the cover price on the mass market was $2.50. So this was a while ago, and, you know, erotica sells to a very different audience, obviously, than children's books. So her name wouldn't really carry a lot of cachet, other than maybe they were trying to get like a crossover sell to the parents. It's like, it's nebulous, you know. But now the best practice would definitely be to use a pen name for that and to like segment those out further. And the Big Rumpus is, again, also has like a not so contemporary feel. Like you can kind of tell that it's a parenting book, but you kind of can't, you don't get a lot of sense of like what you would take from this book beyond maybe entertainment. So there's that. And then we have a Spike, which is the, you know, again, super clear. And, you know, you would normally put Lee on the cover too, but this, I'm guessing, was not done because they had a huge campaign behind the book. So then people put the rest of it together. Minimalism had a, well, it's still kind of having its day, you know, so you're getting the sense of like, okay, this is for fans, you know. And then our own Queer Werewolves Destroy Capitalism was very successful, the most successful book launching the series. It was not intended to be the first book in the series, but it's really fortunate that it was. And it's outselling most of the rest combined, so that's good. It's and again, it's like showing you, it's telling you, it's conveying a lot of things, in one image. And we really struggled with like how much to pantomime the like classic erotica imagery. And then some books you have to again wonder, like, is there an audience at all? Like, is there anybody that really wants a book of things you can do with a stick, or wants to know? Well, there's people that want to know what women want, but like, are they going to read this book to find out? This is and like, if they did, would it help them? And so there's, you have a lot of like false value propositions, or just like kind of misdevelopment things that happen a lot too in cover development, where you're like, these like are both very authoritative covers, and that's almost the most fascinating, that you're like, okay, so like they have professionals, but there's a lot of ellipses after that. And then, sometimes you go real simple. The Dawn of Everything. And again, if you like looked at the comps for either of these books, you would see that there are many, many, many books that look like both of these. Simple text, mild texture, little, you can do a lot with no imagery or very little minimalist imagery, because then people don't miss the details. But then again, it's also, in the end, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, it doesn't actually tell you anything specific about the book. You're like, it's like not even painting a visual. It's really just like big and open-ended. So what you're really buying is the work of two experts that you're probably familiar with if you're reading this book, so it's like their names, I feel like ultimately would be more helpful on top rather than on the bottom, but one person's opinion. And then Mary Roach, has been a successful author of many, many books. I don't think this was among her most popular, but it was new at the time that I put this together. And so, it's again, and I don't think that's like perfectly effective, because you don't notice when nature breaks the law quickly enough. And I feel like, other than Mary Roach, that's why you would buy this book, because that's funny and that's interesting, and there's a lot that goes on there. Sadly, Which Cult Should I Join is now out of print, but and the book is like actually pretty underwhelming. It was a very disappointing book. Like, it should be a lot funnier. But they really tried to make it a humorous history book, and it sort of flopped at doing that. But I feel like the cover is effective, other than some of the imagery takes a backseat. But again, you catch the takeaway. Just like How to Understand Your Gender is an effective cover because it shows the age range, it shows who it's for, it shows what they're getting out of it. It's very clear. You're getting a lot of detail. And I believe Cats is one of the, interestingly, I think this is one of the better Bikes in Space covers, but it's not one of the most successful books in the series. So there's, something to that also. We do tend to skew a little younger looking than these books necessarily are, but there isn't necessarily a strict, we're not looking at it from a like saying it's a young adult, but we're often showing what could be read by a teenager. So there's that, or younger even. And then similarly, I feel like the original Transgalactic Bike Ride cover is, oh, okay, Cats did do better. Okay. Then I realized third most popular in the series. So Transgalactic is number 2. But I would say like this cover is a little bit of a camel. Like it's trying to show a lot of things. It's not necessarily showing any of them explicitly clearly. And so we have a new cover for a new edition of this book, which please provide a round of applause because the previous edition sold out yesterday. So great work, everybody, on doing that. That's a cool book. And we, you know, Charlie Jane Anders, celebrity contributor, but, you know, still, like we really kind of struggled with this book a bit. Similarly, these are two very different two differently effective covers. Teenage Castaways, that's an oil painting. It is actually painted on oil canvas with oil paints. And then the foreground is it's a photoshopped image on top of the sea. And, and it really shows you what it would be like to be captured in a shipwreck. Just like the law in plain English for publishers shows, people love to use the scales of justice for any book that pertains in any way to the law, which I find very entertaining. But, whether that's a book about like people that like circumvented the law or about understanding the law is in this case. This book is not nearly as boring as you would think it is to read. It also does not need to be anywhere near as long as it is in its current length. But it is telling you its value proposition clearly and plainly, and it's working. And, similarly, some more fiction examples. We're looking at one particular story from Born to Be Weird, where it's like showing you the experience, what you're going to get out of reading that book. And this is a later cover of Octavia Butler's Kindred. And, a lot of times what you have is you'll have movie adaptation covers of any classic book. And then you sometimes have to wonder why people will put a blurb about a famous book on the cover. Sometimes it's really just to be like, oh, by the way, somebody else said something about this book that you are already familiar with, because it can put it in new context. It can help you to understand the book in a new way, or maybe you haven't read it in a while, or things like that. Knowing the Score is my favorite example of a book that probably doesn't have an audience, because you're like, if the book is about sports teaching us philosophy, is this how you would express that? Is there an overlap in these two interests? Oh, I'm sorry. How big of an overlap is there in these two interests? It just doesn't seem like that's necessary. I mean, and let's spoiler alert, this book was on remainder and relatively quickly. So, while this is a visually captivating cover, I don't know, like the job of the cover is not to do that. It's to tell you what the book is about and convince the right person that it is for them. Similarly, If Animals Could Talk, this was the original cover before we republished it, when this was published by Sterling. And, it's like, again, you can see with ours, it shows you a little more that there's going to be swearing in the book, that like this really does look like it's a children's book, and people thought it was a children's book, and hilarity ensued. So take from that what you will. Kaylin updates us that Knowing the Score did sell 949 copies on BookScan. I believe it's a major publisher book. So, but there was a time in our world where major publishers were not necessarily concerned about making money as they were about making a book. So hard to know what the goal was and if they achieved it or not. But speaking of comps, so we used basic fermentation, as you can see, hyphenating fermentation here incorrectly. because it should the line break should come between the N and the T, not the T and the A. And so, but we were pushed to do that because it doesn't read correctly if we broke it in the correct place, and it is really hard to read if you put fermentation on one line. So we broke it like that, even though it's technically wrong. And boy, did we hear about it when we tried to do it any other way. And then we used this cover to be our own inspiration for Bread of the Resistance, to, help people be like, oh, okay, got it. This book is like that book. I know that book. Even though it's a different author, we could sort of relate them. It's the same. Well, it's a similar background. They're both, well, you can put it together where it's going from there. Similar fonts, similar iconography, etc. And then sometimes you have covers like this. I would say, while these are very similar, I would say the one on the left works and the one on the right doesn't. And I think there's like some pretty weird but important differences in that you look at the one on the left and you're like, okay, cool, spicy mushrooms, got it. And then you look at the one on the right and you miss that they're watercolors when it's anything smaller than full size up close to your face. And then you sort of miss the fact that, there's lots of books about power foods. There's lots of books about optimizing plant diet to fix X, Y, and Z. So that book was also remaindered in pretty massive quantities. And, I think it's like the compositionally Smart Plants works, but it doesn't really show you everything you need to know. Yes, and it has greeting card vibes, which is especially funny because it doesn't and usually the wisdom on a cookbook is, if it's a celebrity chef, you show the chef on the cover, and if it's not a celebrity chef, you show the most delicious photo of the food within the book. And so both of these fail that test, but I would contend that while the book on the left contains 7 different fonts, you're still like, okay, that's what I'm getting out of it. I like spicy foods, and that's like kind of all you need to know. There's not a million spicy vegan books, and at least there weren't at that time. And so these are some sort of camel and or weird compositional forays into experimentation. Breaking open the head it's like they sort of broke all the design rules, but even so, your brain doesn't quite focus on the mushroom. Your brain focuses on the weird patterning to be like, okay, I'm being drawn in this direction, and you definitely you might even miss the fact that it's like a book about psychedelics. You probably miss the fact that it's a book about shamanism. And so it's like kind of a weird thing to attempt, but I get it why that would seem like a good idea in the boardroom, but maybe less of a good idea when you're doing it. And then similarly, The Gifts of Imperfection, it just looks like it was a book made by somebody that wasn't a designer, because it's like they put a lot of disparate elements into illogical places, and once again your brain doesn't quite know where to go. It doesn't know where the information is. And so the first thing I land on is Your Guide to a Wholehearted Life, and then I notice that the heart is 2 shaking hands, and honestly neither of those are that important into the hierarchy of the information. But again, I think it just kind of needs more of a new subtitle and stuff. But anyway, um, and then it looks like the Oprah sticker was like an added on in post to have like yet another element on the cover, but then it unbalances it further, and you're again like, why is there this and that? Like, why? Yeah. So like if I was to redo this, I would put the gifts of on one line and then draw the eye where you want it, and then have some better hierarchy of like, okay, why does the person looking at this care? Like, what's the significance of the dove? Like, how do we maybe better illustrate that? Like, it's great that she sold 2 million books, but like, why do I want this book? So it's one of those kind of things. And I think that was one of her earlier books, so I'm probably wrong. And then these are really effective, but like, I don't know, I'd say Thinking in Systems is a difficult kind of book cover to design because, like most of those sort of books use gears or other imagery that like honestly aren't that helpful. And so I think this is clever to use both the slinky and the rainbow because it's like communicating something then very different, and it does actually send your eye where it needs to go to Thinking in Systems, which is it's actually both from the same publisher, believe it or not. And Organic Mushroom Farming and Micro Remediation, again, it's easier, but kind of, because mushrooms aren't the easiest thing to depict. Like, it's actually hard to show mushrooms visually in a way that's effective. So you'd want to, they probably put some time into this. And then again, like the best cover designs are the ones that make it look effortless, which is a funny thing to say, but that's like sort of like doing anything well is to make it look easy for the person that's looking at it, to make them feel like they could do it too. It's like just like good writing convinces people that it was not, in fact, a painful slog to write. And then both of these we struggled with a bit. The original cover to The Black Man's Guide to Getting Pulled Over was a parody of Black Panther imagery on the throne, where like that was what the author submitted, and we were like, that doesn't really work because it doesn't actually tell you what it's about, and if anything, it's like a little bit misleading. So like, how about we go a little more on the nose with that? And we did, and we used some bolder, scratchier fonts, and it's like your eye goes to the right places for the most part. And then same thing with woke parenting. Like the only real change we did was bumping up the size of the iconography so that you didn't miss that it was like values-based parenting, whereas most parenting books are, they're all about like how to do it the correct way, which is my way, whereas like this is a little bit different and more specific. And you have to also bear in mind that all design choices should be intentional. Which leads me to my question, which is, what do you think Book Wars, the digital revolution in publishing, with its bullet hole through the cover, is trying to convince to somebody, who hasn't yet read the book? It's like a really weird thing where you're like, are you trying to tell me that publishing is in trouble? Are you are there actual book wars going on? Like, what's the deal here? And, to be fair, this is to some degree a textbook. It's published by Norton. It's a weird kind of book. It's probably already full of outdated information because it came out a few years ago. But, um, similarly, Brown Bohemians, it's like, and this is an oversized book. It's really captivating to hold it in person. And it's like clear what it is, who it's for. I it the details that really strike me are like, I don't entirely know why they chose this person for the cover, like the combination of jewelry and like showing so much of the background. But again, like, this is the kind of book that is often displayed in like a minimalist white environment of like a gift shop or something, or so that you don't have the level of like sensory overwhelm that you usually do when you're browsing books in most sort of environments. So it's a little more forgiving. These Too Tough to Die and How Not to Kill Yourself. Too Tough to Die, I think, is very funny, and it does looks a little bit lead you to believe that it is a story about an actual senior center, but it's like parodying several famous photographs, and that's pretty funny if you are familiar with the references. And this How Not to Kill Yourself cover was actually designed by Blackstone, and then we relicensed it back from them when we did the second edition, because I feel like they really got this book in a way that it is difficult to communicate the value proposition of this book, especially because like we didn't use the word suicide in the subtitle. And these are similarly, some other things like again, on Finding Joseph 1, I'm a bit confused because I'm like, you would think like HR from the Bad Brains would be the more prominent element of this cover, but it is not. But again, it's this kind of book where like, if you're a fan, you would be paying attention to the fact that this is coming out. You would know that it's on the way. You would, I swear it was delayed for like 3 or 4 years also. So there was that aspect of building up momentum. And the very best of dark stock photos, similarly. I do feel like the parental advisory explicit content, it's hard for me to understand if that is like sarcastic or if that's supposed to be informational or both. But especially when, the subtitle is fucked up photography. But, similarly, these are not a book for every audience, but they are very clear in what they are. And then similarly, we went with the very iconographic cover of the pen on the fist for Unfuck Your Writing, and this Matt Gauck cover for I think we started using this on the 2008 edition of Magazine, and then we've updated it 3 times in almost 20 years now. But so that, and it like both of them I think convey the feeling and the value proposition of those books. So those are our titles. And, so it's like when you look at books now, the thing that you really want to think about, like what other covers does it draw from visually? Like what are the iconographic at communicating, say, those value propositions? Questions? I've put you all to sleep. You are more riveted by finances and spreadsheets. Got it.
I don't have a question. I'm saying that.
Thank you for clearing that up. It's a famous first. Was there a question? All right. Well,
I do have a question actually. So when we are giving feedback on titles on cover development, or when say like we're getting feedback from say reps and other parties, potential accounts about cover development, like what type of feedback is the most helpful?
Oh yeah, fantastic question. So usually it's to say what doesn't work, not why it doesn't work. And usually it's not helpful to make suggested changes. It's more helpful to state the problems, because like it's the trouble of like the cake with the M&Ms and the the whole chicken on it is like you can't really communicate more complicated types of feedback. You sort of have to make small adjustments, and that usually solves a problem better than if you followed people's advice to the letter, the result isn't necessarily what they're picturing, because it's like you're introducing new problems. It's like making text edits that change the text on the next page. And so what it's similarly that like any customer feedback is much more helpful for them to tell you what's wrong with it than, or even just something like, I'm not noticing that detail, which is the important detail, is much more helpful than put an eyeball on it big and in the middle, because that it's not going to work the way they're picturing it working.
So when we say things like, is it helpful to know like what our eyes go to first on a cover draft, for instance?
Yeah, that's really helpful, especially if you're like, in thumbnail, I'm missing this, or alternately, like, to say something like, I completely missed that it was about plants.
Oh yeah. Or if something doesn't work for certain color blindnesses, maybe.
Yeah, that's true also. But
cool, thanks. That's helpful.
mm-hmm. And then you just, I mean, I feel like that Brene Brown, like it really feels like it was like designed by a committee. Like it doesn't, it's not like because you're like, the dove makes sense on like a brainstorm, but it doesn't make sense because it makes that part of the cover such that you don't notice her name, and then there's a number of other issues as well. Yeah. Oh, yes. And yeah, right. Christine's example of the cover, which reads Radical Anti-Semitism, when the actual subtitle is A Radical Guide to Fighting Anti-Semitism. Completely opposite,
Yeah, the word radical is kind of a dangerous one these days, generally.
Yeah. But then also like text hierarchy. I mean, I had a lot of fun with the text hierarchy on our box design, because it's like you can give it multiple messages and, you can like do a lot with that. Whereas if you don't notice things like that, you will often convey the opposite of your intended meaning. Anyone who is not Ellie?
I have another question. I don't know where my mind was. Ooh, Abby has a question. I'll read your question, Abby. Is there a popular cover trend that you like or dislike?
I don't really like any contemporary trends, because you're sort of boxing yourself into a very brief shelving window is the problem with that. So if you go with torn paper as your design trope, it's going to feel outdated in 2 years, So you want something that is like more authoritative in terms of like telling people what it is and who it's for and why they care, rather than leaning on a design trend. I mean, there's some that like, there's plenty that are pretty, but it's like, again, more than that.
So when you are, say, in a couple months, when you start working on cover designs for the fall 2025 season, like what's your process with that? Like, where do you start?
You look at what the comps are doing visually, and then you look at what our books in the past are doing and have done successfully. And then you figure out a middle ground between those 3-4 books. And then you try to execute on that. And then if it's something where it like lends itself well to a particular designer or graphic artist or whatever, then I assign it to that person.
If people on staff like have ideas for cover design and development for upcoming titles, is that helpful to share with you?
Not usually, because it's the problem of like something like a concept isn't really achievable because it often doesn't work out in practice the way it is envisioned, or it's like hard enough to describe where you could say like put a trophy on it and dove on it, and then when you do that and you come back, people are like, oh, I meant like it would be at this angle, or it's like there's so much in terms of how it works in practice that a brief like that isn't helpful unless it's like we really need to avoid this kind of imagery. Like that's helpful.
I'm detecting a theme if you want to know what not to do and what isn't working.
Yeah, like when I designed the mental health Oregon thing, they were like, do not put a bridge on the cover. I think the best thing to do is to look at books you like and then think about like how the cover would better be constructed for somebody to learn what the book is about who hasn't yet read the book.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub,
On Twitter at microcosm,
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at microcosm_pub.
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.